All right. We don't need to start with prayer. We just started with a whole liturgy. We're still in the grace. So tonight we're going to do continue with our discussion of the calendar. We got up through the 5th week of Lent last time. I'm going to wait. We're going to do May and then June, and then we'll talk the 6th week and Holy Week, because we're going to get a little closer to those. There'll be more time to do that way. So the month of May, sorry, that doesn't show up very well. The month does not have any great feasts from the Menaion, because Pascha and Pentecost are so prevalent during this period, right? May is always Paschal in some form or another. Even if Pascha doesn't occur until, say, the first week of May, like last year, the rest of the month is still Paschal. And even if it occurs earlier in April, at least some of May is going to be Paschal, and you're going to get into Ascension and Pentecost by the end of the month, right? And so, but as a result of that, right, it's spring, or I guess, or fall, depending on where you are. Either way, it's beautiful. The weather's mild. It's nice. It's pretty, you know, it's Paschal and joyful and really a special month. So I just wanted to look at some of the prevalent feasts that we find during the month of May. So early in the month we have May 5th, the holy and great martyr Irene. Saint Irene was the daughter of a Persian noble, king of a small kingdom in Persia. Born in the late 3rd and early 4th century. Her father, the Persians at this time were Zoroastrian, right? They were not, Islam didn't exist yet. They were Zoroastrian for the most part. And he was afraid that she would be corrupted by Christians and by other foreign influences. And so he basically kept her locked away and secluded. Similar in some ways to the life of St. Catherine the Great, the Great Martyr. But he hired a tutor for her. And little did he know the tutor he hired was actually a secret Christian. And so the tutor was teaching her, and as he was teaching her, he saw her great intelligence and her great spiritual sensitivity, and he began slowly but surely to teach her Christian principles, until eventually she became completely convinced of the truth of Christianity, which she had to hide from her father. But she eventually desired very greatly to be a Christian, and so she was secretly baptized. Her name had been Penelope. Ever since Alexander the Great, there were Greek influences in that part of Persia. But she was secretly baptized with the name Irene, or peace. When her father found out, he actually had her tortured, trying to get her to worship the pagan gods. When he ended up being harmed instead, basically what happened is he tried to have her trampled by horses. One of the horses actually grabbed his arm and ripped the arm off his socket. St. Irene, seeing this, pacified the horses, walked up and healed him, and reattached his arm. He sees this miracle, and he and his wife end up becoming Christians themselves instead. She ends up then traveling in many parts of Asia Minor and Greece. She ends up tortured, I think, at least 3 additional times. And finally, but every time she would then be delivered and healed. And finally, she got to the end of her life and realized that it was time for her to depart, that she was dying. And so she found there was this cave tomb, and she just walked to it, told her disciples to close the door behind her, and reposed. But even though she didn't die from the tortures, the fact that she actually went through the tortures multiple times in her life, nevertheless gained her the title of Great Martyr. All of the accounts say that her preaching and the example of her miracles and her witness converted many thousands of people to Christianity during her life. I'm almost not really doing it justice at all. It's an incredible story. Read her life if you can. And it's a lot better than wearing sombreros and doing a fake wannabe Mexican holiday. Even though I love tacos. I still love our dearly beloved friend, Themis. May 5th was his birthday. And so he refused to call it Cinco de Mayo, it was Cinco de Themis. And was it last year, it was Pascha. And it ended up being his last Pascha, in fact, on Earth. And he just loved the fact that Cinco de Themis was also Pascha. The same day, though, we celebrate a newly revealed saint, which is Ephrem of Neamakri. So Saint Ephrem was born on September 14, 1384. He became a monk on the mountain near Neamakri, which is not far from Athens, right on the Aegean coast, right there. He was an exemplary monk, even as a young man. And he ended up being tortured and killed by Turkish pirates in the year 1425. This is before the fall of Constantinople, but the Turks are making all sorts of inroads everywhere, and Turkish pirates end up killing him. He was buried there along with other monks who were martyred, and basically forgotten about for more than 500 years after that. I'll come back and tell you about this icon in a minute. Much later, there came to be a women's monastery there in Neamakri. And in 1950, the abbess, Irondisa Makaria, who died April 23rd, 1999, she was praying when she felt compelled. She was contemplating to herself, I wonder how many of those buried in this cemetery were martyred, right? Because the cemetery went back many, many centuries. And at one point she gets to an abandoned, dilapidated sort of ruins of a cell and feels compelled, there's a martyr here. And she gets the guy who's like the groundskeeper for the monastery to start digging. And he starts mocking her, he starts making fun of her, and he's like, you're not gonna come finding a saint after all this time just buried there. Some unknown, just forgotten saint, give me a break. And she keeps pushing him, keeps pushing. Finally he says, okay, fine, I'll dig. He starts digging in this cell, and the shovel goes in, and he takes the dirt off, and they see a skull. And in that moment, the fragrance of myrrh overtakes both of them. It's so powerful. And she says, see, I told you. He begins to weep and makes the sign of the cross and says, forgive me. And they exhume his relics that continued to stream myrrh. And over the next 2 nights, at night when she was sleeping, Saint Ephrem would appear to her and explain to her. He said, I'm Ephrem. And then began to teach her his life story and the story of his martyrdom and what he had went through. His relics are there in the monastery there in Neamakri, and they've been miracle working ever since. He's especially invoked for troubled youth and for those with addiction issues. I know Joanna has been to see him. I'm taking my family to go see him in June, and I'm really excited. I have a special soft spot for him. But this is the Irondisa. And this icon, so this was painted by the famous painter, Fotios Kontoglou, in the 20th century. He was this famous iconographer, and he prayed and prayed and prayed. The last icon he ever painted in his life was this icon, praying to Saint Ephrem to reveal to him how he looked so that he could paint the correct icon for him. Nobody knows how, but he then creates this icon, and not long later composes. And this has now become the model for every icon of Saint Ephrem. And the fact that the Irondisa, who had seen him multiple times, approved of it and held his icons, sort of testifies the veracity of what Foti painted and how he must have had that revealed to him.
What's the name of the painter again?
Fotios Kontoglou.
Kontoglou.
Really a remarkable iconographer, chanter, author, remarkable figure in the 20th century and worth reading about. And very pious, obviously. All right. Any questions on Saint Ephrem or Saint Irene? May 5th is a really cool name. Really great saints. The next saint I want to highlight is Saint Alexis Toth. So he's an American saint, celebrated May 7th. He was born March 14th, 1853 in modern-day Slovakia. At that time, it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was well educated and a married priest in the Eastern Catholic Church. So he was a Catholic priest. In that part of the world, right, there are married Catholic priests. They celebrate liturgy like the Orthodox do, and they're allowed to be married. But only a few years after he was married, I think he was married in either 78 or 79, and his wife had a child, and then just a few years later, his wife and child died. And in 1889, there was a parish of Eastern Catholics in Minneapolis, Minnesota, that was asking for a priest. And so he answered the call and traveled to Minnesota. And when he got there, basically he went to go check in with the local Catholic bishop, Bishop Ireland, who basically despised him for having been married, for having had a child, and denigrated the Eastern traditions and so on. And this led him to kind of come to a realization of what had been growing in his heart for years, which is that he needed to be in the Orthodox Church, that being in this Eastern Catholic parish was a betrayal of the Eastern tradition. And so he made contact with the Russian bishop in San Francisco, Bishop Vladimir, and told him of his desire. So he met him in 1891, and in March of 1892, he and 361 parishioners were received into the Orthodox Church from that parish there in Minneapolis. From then on until the end of his life, he continued to travel extensively throughout North America, visiting Eastern Catholic parishes and encouraging them to embrace Orthodoxy and come back to the traditions of their fathers. By the time he reposed in 1909, he had facilitated the conversion of 20,000 Catholics into the Orthodox Church. That momentum continued, and only 7 years later, by 1916, that number had grown to 100,000 Catholics who had converted to Orthodoxy as a result of his preaching and missionary work. It's basically what today we call the OCA. Today's OCA is largely the result of his preaching and missionary activity. He was tireless, non-stop crisscrossing the continent under incredibly difficult conditions. I mean, think about that kind of apostolic work, that in modern times, one man, by the grace of the Holy Spirit, could be responsible for 100,000 people coming into Orthodoxy. Right? No, that's right. They have his relics in Pleasanton. Yes, the relic of his at St. Innocent's Church. Yeah. So he was canonized in 1994, and the main parts of his relics are there in St. Tikhon's Monastery in Pennsylvania. Again, an incredible saint worth reading about, especially as for us former Catholics, he has a soft spot in my heart. But I mean, just to think about that, right? To in his despair and sadness over having lost his wife and his child, he moves to a new continent and then converts, brings his parish with him, and then spends the next, whatever that is, 28 years, crisscrossing the continent, and leads to the conversion of 100,000 people. What's that?
God gave him 100,000.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So then May 21st, we have the Feast of Saints Constantine and Helen, which is obviously a big feast day. Saint Helen was born as Flavia Julia Elena. I have to remind people they were Romans. In the late 240s, likely in the northwest part of Asia Minor. They think she actually might have been a native Greek speaker, although her name was very much Latin. She married Constantius, who became Caesar in 293, and then the Augustus, or emperor, in 305 to 306. Although he had divorced her sometime around 289 to support his political ambitions. He ended up divorcing her to marry the daughter of, I think, Maximian, which then results in him becoming Caesar just a few years later. Nevertheless, he and St. Helen had a child, Constantine, in approximately 272, who was born in what is today the city of Nice in Serbia. St. Constantine became Augustus in 306 in York upon his father's death, which basically made him at least the claim. So, I think it was under Diocletian, the rule of the Roman Empire had been divided into a tetrarchy. So there were two Caesars, one in the west, one in the east, and two Augusti, right? One in the west and one in the east. So his dad had been the Augustus in the west. He becomes Augustus in the west in 306 in Great Britain, in York, on his father's death. But there's still a Caesar in the west, right? And then there's a Caesar and an Augustus in the east. So over the course of the next 6 or so years, he ends up securing basically sole rule of the western part of the empire in 312, battling against the pagans Maxentius and Maximian Galerius. Of course, this is the famous Battle of Milvian Bridge in Rome, where he has the vision of the hero, right? The first two letters of Christ in Greek, Christos. And he receives the message in hoc signo vinces, right? And teutonica, in this sign conquer, right? And so he has the hero, written onto the shields and the armor of all of his men, and the standard held up, and in the name of Christ they go forward and win. The next year, in 313, he issues the Edict of Milan, which basically was an edict of toleration. So Christianity was no longer outlawed. And then eventually, by 323, he becomes sole ruler of the entire empire. So now the East and the West are both consolidated under his rule in 323. In 325, in response to the heresy of Arianism, he calls the First Ecumenical Council in Nicaea, which is just across the Bosphorus from Constantinople. Arius was, of course, a priest of Alexandria who basically denied the incarnation. He said that Christ was a divine person, or basically a God with a small g, right? That he wasn't really equal to the Father. He was this other lesser kind of divine guy. And so he's condemned, and that's where we get the doctrine of consubstantiality with the Father, right? We have the same essence or substance with the Father. So in approximately 326, St. Helen goes on a tour of Palestine and the Holy Land, during which she discovers the true cross. There's a vision that she has to dig in a particular place. They dig and they find 3 crosses there. So now they're wondering which is Christ and which is the thieves, right? And it just so happens that in that moment there's a funeral walking by, and they touch all three to the dead man, and on one of them, the man rises from the dead. And they say, well, that's the cross of Christ. St. Constantine then orders the construction of the original Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. And St. Helen reposes in 327. She had, for most of Constantine's rule, she actually lived in a palace in Rome. And it's only in 323 that she moves to Constantinople, and she ends up dying basically there. St. Constantine continues to rule, and in 337, having received baptism and the other holy mysteries, he reposes. Questions about them? He's such a pivotal figure, right, in all of Christianity, Christian history, and frankly, world history. But there's so much that could be said, and there's no way to really do justice to any of that. I think I'll say one thing. First of all, I reject those who, there is a pushback and a distaste for piety for St. Constantine in particular. I think those are people reading his life with an agenda. There is no question in my mind that he is a saint. That said, that doesn't mean that the close relationship between the church and empire that really comes about with St. Theodosius I, right? About a little over a century later. But that's not to say that that relationship wasn't without some difficulty, right? And, that identification between an earthly kingdom and the heavenly kingdom became a temptation for many people over the course of the next 1,000+ years, right? In fact, really much more than that, 1,700 years, because I think still to this day there are many Christians that struggle with that. We saw that in Russia in the 18th and 19th centuries and into the 20th century. We see it, frankly, in some places still to this day, and I think there's a lot of yearning. There's problems with that.
I wanted to say yes, because I know because a lot of people debate that he's a saint and he was pagan and he was this and that, but the fact that he stopped the persecution of Christianity and allowed everybody to believe whatever they want, it's a huge thing.
Massively. And what I would say is that doesn't make someone a saint. It makes them a really good emperor. It doesn't make them a saint. But when you read, for example, the account at the First Ecumenical Council, remember they're still coming out of persecution not that long ago, right? In the East, persecution continued right up to 312. There's accounts that during the council, when he greeted the bishops, there were many bishops who came who were maimed or bore the scars of their torture for the faith. As they assembled, he paused and went one by one to each of those bishops and kissed the place of their scars or their maiming. The hands, the fingers, the eyes, the ears, the etc. that were missing, all of the places where they had been wounded for defending the faith. He went one by one and venerated their wounds and bowed before them and said, I who have taken blood have no right to even be in your presence. Right? That's the piety of a saint. Just one glimpse of this, right? He delayed baptism largely because he felt he was not worthy of it. We would normally not encourage that, right? It was a little more common in that time. And he felt that because of the bloodshed that he had committed, and the other sins that he had committed over the course of his lifetime, that he didn't feel worthy, and he was afraid that if he received baptism, he would fall back into his own sins as emperor. And so he delayed. There's a sense of repentance about it. So no, in my mind, there's no question that it's a sin. That doesn't mean that that model needs to be the model for all of church history until the second coming. And I mean, there's much to be said about how fraught it is when Christianity becomes official. Anyway, enough said. I'm not going to get on that soapbox.
Is there any validity to the argument that St. Constantine was baptized Arian official?
No, I saw the title of an article refuting that earlier when I was preparing it. I didn't read into it too much. I mean, I don't think so.
Would it make a difference if he was?
I don't know.
Yeah.
There were Arian sympathizers around him. Eusebius of Caesarea seems to have still had some sympathies. But I guess what I would say is, it is absolutely unfathomable to me that the man who was responsible for calling the First Ecumenical Council read out, approved, and signed the acts of the First Ecumenical Council condemning the Arians as heretics and anathema would then accept the baptism from one. Like, there's a lot of dots you'd have to connect for me to believe that, right? I guess I'll just say that. I mean, I think that there are strong arguments for why that historically is not the case, was probably slander. But just from sort of that basic heuristic, like I don't see how you get from one to the next, right? It'd be like saying, in his dying vote, Barack Obama voted for a Republican. I mean, I don't know. You know what I mean? Like, it's just sort of, no, I don't think so. I don't know. That's maybe too trivial of an example. But I mean, it's just sort of hard for me to.
You think he had options, right?
Of course he did. Yeah. I mean, yeah. So, other prominent saints in May, you have the prophet Jeremiah, May 1. St. Matrona the Blind of Moscow, a 20th century saint. If you don't know St. Matrona in Moscow, learn about her. She's incredible. The Righteous Job, May 6th. The Manna of St. John the Theologian, May 8th. So his tomb in Ephesus, once a year on May 8th, there was this fragrant, like myrrh dust that would come up from his tomb and cover his tomb. And the people would come, and they would take it and sort of bathe on it or sprinkle it in water and drink it, and they would be healed. It was a strange kind of myrrh. Rather than an oil myrrh, it was a dust myrrh. And the people there called it, piously, manna, right? So we celebrate that miracle on May 8th. The prophet Isaiah, May 9th. St. Christopher on May 9th. The third finding of the head of St. John the Baptist, May 25th. Thank God we now know where it is. St. John the Russian, May 27th, another remarkable saint. I was just telling Carlene last night a story of someone in our parish who had been in the hospital for a while, and they had told him he was probably going to be there for a while longer. They couldn't tell him when he was going to leave, but it was going to be a while. And Father had asked me to go see him. And as I was going to leave, I saw a little bottle of oil from St. John the Russian sitting there that somebody had brought back for me. And I thought, I guess I'll just take that. I'll anoint him with that. Walked out the door, went to the hospital. chatted with him a little bit, anointed him with the oil. And as I pulled it out and explained what it was, his wife goes, "Oh, we were just there this summer. That was our favorite pilgrimage spot of the whole summer. We love St. John the Russian." Who's on the island of Evia, is where his relatives are. So I anoint him with the oil, think nothing of it, say goodnight, leave. Next day I call to find out, how he's doing, because I knew he was going to have a consult with his doctor that day. And his wife answers the phone and says, "Oh no, he's home already."
Oh,
He's home. So I love St. John the Russian. He's pretty incredible.
I want to visit.
And then of course Saint Emilia, the mother of Saint Basil, and all of the other holy siblings on May 30th. So a lot of really, really great saints in May, and to some extent they get sort of rightfully overshadowed by Pascha. But nevertheless, there's a lot of really, really great saints. Any questions or thoughts? Responses we're always asking.
Third columns of stars, right?
Yes, that is. I don't know which summer it is. So that would be 31, 30, 29, 28, May 27th. With St. John the Russian.
In the booth thing, is that what you're talking
Yeah. Those are representing stylites. So let's see. Orthodox saints. May 27th. I don't know what year that was. St. John the Russian. It's not showing stylites. St. Bede. I don't know, did I get the date wrong? Is it 28? No. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know which stylites these are, but yes, those are stylites. Sorry. Anyway, all right. Any other questions? Lord of the powers, be with us, for in times of distress we have no other help but you, Lord of the powers, have mercy on us. Prayers of our fathers, which is Christ, God,